and welcome to yet another game I played on the Pokémon TCG Online. And this one's going to be with what a lot of people probably consider one of the favorite decks they have in the format. At least a very popular deck on this channel so far. It's going to be RayBoar. Rayquaza Emboar. It's kind of the alternative to Blastoise, but it runs good old Emboar instead of the big turtle Blastoise. So we'll see how this one turns out. Looks like we are going up against a Team Plasma deck. Recently, Team Plasma decks have revolved more around Lugia EX and Snorlax, as opposed to the Plasma Kyurem. But we do see a Kyurem here, which is kind of scary. I don't really like seeing a Kyurem when I'm opening with the Tepig. I'm happy that the first turn rules are in effect, so I wouldn't have to worry about being knocked out in the first turn anymore by a Frost Spear, but it's still a little intimidating to see that. It can put a lot of pressure on very early, and that's not something I like to deal with. But we have some interesting decisions here on what I want to have happen. I don't know if my opponent plays Pokemon Catcher. If my opponent does play Pokemon Catcher, then I would have to worry about Tepig being knocked out by a Frost Spear on the first turn. And if that's the case, that's going to be some bad news. The whole strategy of this deck is to get Emboar into play, to use Inferno Fandango to play as many fire energy as you want in a turn, and then go ahead and power up a Rayquaza EX to use Dragon Burst to do tons and tons of damage and basically knock your opponent's Pokemon out in one hit. So I'm going to go ahead and Skyla for a Level Ball, get a second Tepig, and then Ultra Ball for the Rayquaza EX, playing an Escape Rope to force out my opponent's Deoxys EX, which is pretty nice. This will possibly alleviate some of the pressure that can happen on turn one. My opponent would need a Colress Machine, an Energy, and a Switching card in order to knock me out. Or not knock out, attack me with Kyurem's Frost Spear. So maybe that Escape Rope bought us some time. I left myself with a Juniper to draw 7 fresh cards, but those are not very pretty cards. We got the good old-fashioned 3-of-a-kind set of superior energy retrieval. Not exactly what I'm looking for on turn 2 there, hoping to get, like a rare candy and an Emboar. But instead I get like a Reshiram, 3 superior energy retrieval, and a fire energy. But at least we have a supporter for the next turn, so it's tough to complain too much. Now I will probably need to get an Emboar out next turn, the turn after by the latest, in order to have a shot at this game, right? You really need Emboar out pretty quickly. Turn 2 is ideal. Turn 3 is acceptable. Turn 4, you're kind of pushing it. And turn 5, you're usually very far behind. I had a painful discard off of that Juniper, having to discard the Super Rod, because I've cut down to 2 Rayquaza EX in this deck in favor of a second Reshiram, because of how popular Virizion Genesect decks have been. And Reshiram is incredibly powerful against Virizion Genesect, since for 3 energy you can Blue Flare and knock out basically their entire deck. But my second Rayquaza EX is prized, and Super Rod is in the discard. So I'm basically going to have to work with 1 Rayquaza EX for most of this game. Play the Colress there for 6 cards. Another swing and a miss. Those superior energy retrievals really like me. I'm going to retreat into Reshiram to just kind of take a hit. And, in case my opponent would Blizzard Burn with Kyurem, I don't really mind if Reshiram takes the hit. But if Rayquaza EX goes down, not only do I lose my only Rayquaza, but also I lose 2 prizes. Or rather, my opponent takes 2 prizes, so I don't want to have that happen. But this is starting to get out of hand very quickly. The only way you really beat these Team Plasma decks is if you don't allow them to build up enough energy. But when my opponent is allowed to build up a Kyurem and then an Absol and then all sorts of stuff, the non-EX attackers overwhelm your EX attackers, and it's just basic math. They beat you in the prize trade, basically. So this is not looking good right now. I did get hit by another Raid Knuckle for 50 damage, and I could have played an N here, but I'm deciding, you know what? Let's not take any more chances, even though I won't be able to attack this turn because I don't have the energy to do so. We can play Skyla for an Ultra Ball here, and I'm just playing the Ultra Ball so that I can draw more cards from my Tropical Beach. Could have taken a Heavy Ball instead, but I decided to do Ultra Ball because I'll need to draw into some Fire Energy for next turn. So I wanted to draw some extra cards, and we did get the Fire off of the Tropical Beach, and we're going to try to set up, I don't know. It's not looking good right now, that's for sure, and we see an Escape Rope. Uh-oh. I'm going to promote Tepig as my sacrifice. Sorry, little guy. You're the only one I can really afford to throw out to the Lions at this point. And we do see a Frozen City, which is very painful considering now 2 of my 3 Tropical Beach are in the discard pile. Frozen City kills these kinds of decks because you have to attach so many energy from your hand, and each time you do, you take 20 damage. And that's going to add up very quickly. So this is not looking good for old RayBoar right now. But it's a long game. My opponent's only taken 1 prize, so who knows. I do have another counter stadium, the Tropical Beach here. I have some options here. I'm going to try to go for the Dragon Burst knockout at this point. I do need 2 more Fire Energy, though. Another option would be to take advantage of my opponent's Frozen City and actually attach 3 times to Reshiram, putting 60 damage on it, putting it up to 110 damage, making Outrage do 130 and knocking out the Kyurem in 1 hit. So those are my 2 options at this point. But if I do that, then it's just an easy Raid Knuckle knockout. From Thundurus EX. My opponent gets to power up another attacker. So I'm going to go ahead and go for the Dragon Burst knockout. And it looks like we got those Fire Energy we needed. Gonna Inferno Fandango, 2 fire onto the Rayquaza EX. And then bench a new Reshiram. And discard 3 Fire Energy for 180 damage. It's a really costly discard just to take 1 prize. But you gotta do what you gotta do. And we take down the first Kyurem. But we're about to fall behind 2 prizes here because Absol will easily finish off this Rayquaza EX. Now this is going to be pretty much a race from here on out. It's, who's going to flinch first. We're both kind of at the point where we're set up pretty well. I've got my Emboar going. We got some attackers. And my opponent's got all sorts of stuff powered up and a lot of energy in play. You see the Prism Energy go on to the Kyurem, and a failed Chorus Machine. That's a pretty big deal. My opponent must be out of Plasma Energy in the deck, which is actually a huge deal. But we'll have to see what happens here. Now, I have some decisions here. I can put down a Float Stone and then Superior Energy Retrieval, or play a Tool Scrapper and then play the Superior. And I'm going to decide the Tool Scrapper is actually the right thing to do, just because Keldeo Russian Retreat can be such a big deal for preserving energy if like a Thundurus EX wants to retreat, and also it allows Kyurem to use Blizzard Burn on back-to-back turns. So neither of those are things I really want to have happen. So I decided to go for the Tool Scrapper. I don't think Float Stone will be an issue. I don't think my opponent plays Pokemon Catcher. And even if he does, I do have the Dowsing Machine to fall back on for some switching cards. But we will definitely see what happens from here. I'm going to actually party like it's 2011 and Blue Flare for 120 damage. RayBoar is back. Gonna knock out the Absol. We get the Execute out of the prizes. Execute is a card I love in this deck, because you have to discard so many cards for stuff like Superior Energy Retrieval, Dowsing Machine, Ultra Ball. You end up discarding so many cards that having that execute to always pull out of your discard pile and then discard immediately for these cards is so useful. And pretty much every time I play this deck, I'm so thankful I actually have execute to work with. Now, let's see. I do get hit here by Raiden Knuckle for 50. Looks like my opponent is favoring, kind of powering up multiple Kyurem again at this point, which is probably a solid strategy, right? If you power up a couple Kyurem, then how am I supposed to stop that? I still have to take 4 prizes here, so I have to kind of decide what do I want to do at this point. I'm going to energy search, just grab an energy out of the deck, and we'll see what we have to work with at this point. We do have a Mewtwo in there. That can kind of clean up for the last prize or two, if that's possible. But we got all sorts of stuff to worry about. And not too many resources left, besides the Superior Energy Retrievals. I'm just going to attach to the active and Outrage for what looks like 90 damage. And that's going to force a Kyurem to come out if he wants to take a knockout, because I have 60 HP left. So if Thundurus wants to Raiden Knuckle, then, well, I survive with 10 HP and then Outrage for the knockout, which doesn't seem like a very favorable situation for my opponent, but I suppose that is a possibility. The likely thing that's going to happen is Kyurem will come out in Frost Spear, take a knockout, put 30 somewhere else, and then that'll really put me on the defensive. And I'm not really sure how I'm going to take all of my prizes if that's going to be the case. I still have to take 4 prizes. Jeez. I knocked out a Kyurem and an Absol already, and I'm still this far away from winning the game. Yikes. So this is kind of the strength of this kind of a plasma deck at this point in the format without Pokemon Catcher at your disposal all the time. You have to take so many knockouts. But fortunately, my opponent did Raiden Knuckle one more time, which will allow me to get an easy Outrage knockout and collect 2 prizes here. So this is definitely a possibility to win at this point. I'm going to go down to 2 prizes. The most my opponent can really do is, take a knockout on Reshiram this turn, which I'm not too afraid of. I get the other Rayquaza EX out of my prizes. That's beautiful. And we do see Team Plasma Ball. It's going to grab a Thundurus EX for my opponent, probably just thinning out cards or something, preparing a Thundurus EX perhaps. I'm not sure what for. But we see the Frost Spear for the knockout. Going to do 30 to the Rayquaza. And now here's the big turn. We can actually take advantage of my opponent's Frozen City here, which is going to be pretty sweet. Now I do have the Superior Energy Retrieval. We can discard Execute and then Rare Candy. I can go ahead and grab 4 energy out of the discard pile. Take 3 fire and then maybe a lightning. And we're going to Inferno Fandango 3 times onto the Reshiram, putting it up to 110 damage and then outraging the Kyurem for a knockout. This is a very unusual play. We are now placing 5 energy onto a Reshiram just to outrage for a knockout, which is horribly inefficient. But in this situation, we don't really care about efficiency because, heck, we got a lot of resources to work with in terms of energy. So we may as well go ahead and use them. And then we can also put down the Rayquaza EX, attach a lightning to it in preparation for an N. I should probably use Dowsing Machine and then discard Emboar and Execute again to just grab back a supporter in case of an N. Looks like I overlooked that. The idea there is to discard the Emboar so I don't redraw it off of an N. But looks like I'm just going to go ahead and take the knockout. Kind of overlooking that. And oh boy, here is the N, and oh baby. Now, normally this would be bad. You just wouldn't have the cards to discard for Superior Energy Retrieval. You need to discard 2 cards. But with Execute, we can Propagation, discard the 2 cards for Superior Energy Retrieval, get back the 4 fire, and Inferno Fandango 1 time, 2 time, and 3 times. There we go. And Dragon Burst for the win in a very unlikely fashion. But RayBoar sometimes has some surprising ways to win. And it can be a very versatile deck with all sorts of tricks up its sleeves with all these different attackers and such. And it just has some raw power sometimes. Dragon Burst is pretty good, gotta say. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will definitely have some more for you soon. I am Pooka from the Top Cut, and I will see you guys next time.